Alright guys, how's it going? We are approaching almost 2 years since AMD launched their first 7nm product and the world's first 7nm GPU, which was the Vega 20 based MI50 GPU accelerator. These launched in November 2018, and then they were followed a couple of months later by the prosumer Radeon 7, which is based on this same Vega 20 chip. After that, we waited just a little bit too long on Navi arriving, which was in July 2019. Not too long after which, the Radeon Technologies Group began talking up RDNA 2, with promises of 50% higher performance per watt. And Nvidia, during all of this, were nowhere to be seen near 7nm. Turing was TSMC 12nm, which was really just their old 16nm FinFET node, with a bit of marketing attached. In fact, the only thing we'd heard about Nvidia and 7nm was the somewhat shocking news that Samsung, and not TSMC, would be their partner for the majority of their 7nm GPUs. And over at the Korean Herald, dated July 2nd, 2019, and during a press conference in Seoul, Korea, Nvidia's Korean chief Yoo Young-yoon said that its production of advanced GPUs will be conducted by Samsung Electronics with its 7nm EUV process. Until recently, Samsung has been working really hard to secure partners for foundry cooperation. And remember that last point because this is quite important. Now, Yu did not reveal the exact amount of foundry production by Samsung. However, he acknowledged that production would be substantial. However, as it happened, for most of the back half of 2019, we started hearing rumours of problems with Samsung's 7nm node. And it is worth pointing out that, unlike TSMC's initial 7nm process or Intel's 10nm, Samsung's 7nm node does utilise EUV. Now, you might be thinking, well, Jim, I know this already. And that's because I went over all of this in my previous video 10 weeks ago, Graphics the Next Generation. And also in this video, I noted that at the end of 2019, Nvidia's CEO Jensen Huang had changed his tune entirely, stating flatly that most of the next generation 7nm orders will be handed over to TSMC, and only a very, very, very small proportion of orders will be given to Samsung. Alright, so we know that Nvidia planned on switching to Samsung from TSMC, and we know that Samsung's 7nm hasn't really worked out well for them, with the 7nm yield cited as being the main issue. At this point, it's worth having a look at the industry manufacturing nodes so we can get a better understanding of what this actually means. If we go back to the 16 and 14nm nodes, you recall that TSMC had their initial 16nm FinFET, what they call N16 here, whereas Samsung had 14nm FinFET, this LPE. This was Samsung's initial offering. And looking at this slide, we can see how Samsung's 14nm progressed over the months and years. Like I said, 14LPE, that was their initial offering, and it was mostly used with their own mobile chips. This 14LPP optimization was actually co-developed with GlobalFoundries. And you remember, GlobalFoundries messed up their own 14nm, and so they had to license Samsung's 14. However, after doing that, they went on to develop this 14LPP, which is a higher performance node. This was kind of co-developed by both GlobalFoundries and Samsung, and 14LPP was the node that Polaris and Zen 1 were manufactured on. And after that we can see 14LPC and LPU, which are still based on this same 14nm. And then at the bottom you've got this 11LPP. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that 11LPP must be a lot better than 14LPP, but really this slide shows that this is just marketing, and it's essentially all based on the same 14nm node. Now for TSMC, like I said, N16, their 16nm FinFET, and we can see how that progressed onto N12. It's the same colour, because it's basically the same node. And this is what Turing was manufactured on. Pascal N16, Turing N12. And again, it really is just marketing, and I guess it also helps to explain why Samsung felt the need to call theirs 11LPP. But we can see that TSMC's 10nm node, N10, that is a different node. And if we look at the Samsung chart, we can see that their 10 is also different. This was a new node compared to 14 and all its derivatives. On TSMC, it's safe to say they didn't do a whole lot on N10, and instead they quickly moved on to another new node, N7, TSMC 7nm. But Samsung did the same again and optimized 10 to 10 LPP, then 8 LPP, and continued to enhance it. And again, pretty much marketing, this 8 is really close to their 10. And this too is very important and worth remembering. Now, if we move on to the current 7nm nodes of each, we can see that Samsung have gone 7, 6, 5, 4. So TSMC started with N7. Again, that was the original node that Zen 2 and Vega 20 were manufactured on. This N7P was an optimization, which RDNA 1 was manufactured on. So Navi 10, basically, your 5700 XT. And this N7 Plus is TSMC's first 7nm EUV node. The interesting thing about this is their N6 node is basically just a progression of N7P, and this is not EUV. And for TSMC, we can see that N5 is again yet another completely different node, and again it incorporates EUV. So there is a slight difference here. That is definitely worth remembering. Samsung's 7, 6, 5 and 4 are all essentially the same node with tweaks or optimizations. And remember, all of these incorporate EUV. Whereas TSMC's 7 and 5 nodes are completely different, although N5 will be pretty similar to N7 Plus, as they are both EUV. Now, hopefully you followed that as it got pretty confusing. But now back to Ampere. It wasn't super surprising when Nvidia finally announced their first 7nm GPU. A100 was being manufactured at TSMC. After all, Samsung were toiling with 7nm yield, and these are huge chips, with A100 being a mammoth 826 square millimeters, which would be a nightmare on a badly yielding process. And Jensen, as you recall, also said that TSMC would be getting the majority of next-gen 7nm orders. However, given the very small volume of the A100, that didn't really mean a whole lot in terms of gaming cards. If TSMC were getting the majority of 7nm orders, what did that mean for GeForce Ampere? Well, the obvious answer to that is that they too will be manufactured on TSMC's 7nm. But none of the recent leaks or rumours have suggested that that will happen. Absolutely every leak and rumour, in fact, has been quite adamant that Nvidia's GeForce Ampere cards would be manufactured at Samsung, most likely on their 8nm node, with perhaps a few cards being at TSMC's 7nm still. And a very good leaker over at Twitter, Popite Kimmy, who absolutely nailed Nvidia's A100 specs months ago. He's also been outing Ampere codenames and possible specs as well for some time. And he also recently stated quite categorically on this Twitter poll, which asked, do you think Nvidia's upcoming Ampere gaming GPUs will be based on TSMC's 7nm node, Samsung's 8nm node, or a mix between the two? His response was 100% Samsung 8nm, developed from 10. And again, we can see what he means. Looking back at this Samsung slide, 8 developed from 10. And essentially, this is what the claims have been now for some months. Nvidia would manufacture their next generation GeForce on this older, better yielding process. And that wasn't really controversial. After all, they've been doing exactly that now with an even older 12nm/16nm TSMC process. This Samsung 10/8, that will be an improvement over that regardless. And to back that point up further, we recently learned of a 12-pin PCIe connector for the next generation. At first I dismissed that rumour as complete nonsense. However, a couple of weeks ago, one of my sources told me this. EVGA might go with it on their cards, ASUS and MSI might not. And I was also told that we will need to use a 2x 8-pin to feed into this 1x 12-pin. And they finished with, Nvidia did not work with any PSU vendors on this connector. And so the 12-pin is legit, and it lends weight to the theory that Ampere will be something of a power hog on this older 10/8 node. The issue I have here though is that my info said the exact opposite. Ampere, at least the Quadro Ampere, was very power efficient. And if you recall again from this video 10 weeks ago, I was the first to say that Nvidia were no longer concerned about Big Navi. Normally this is the kind of info that I would take with a grain of salt, especially given all the evidence pointing otherwise. However, the same source that told me that provided me with a photograph of an actual Ampere card, which makes it kind of hard to ignore. But Conflicting information. That is something that I just don't like. But there's always a reason. Just need to think a little bit harder to get to the bottom of it. And as you can see, my response on the Twitter poll was simply, damn, this is gonna be one amusing poll. Amusing because the correct answer, if I'm right that is, wasn't available as an option. Now, it goes without saying that what you're about to hear is speculation based on my analysis of this situation. But hopefully, after you've heard me out, you'll come to the same conclusion. And let's just break down the info that we have into simple sentences. Starting a year ago, Nvidia's Korean chief said, "It is meaningful that Samsung Electronics' 7nm process would be used in manufacturing our next generation GPU." And as if to hammer that point home, according to DigiTimes in Taiwan, Nvidia has decided to use Samsung's 7nm EUV technology to produce its GPUs in 2020. Now, I showed you what that meant before, and here's another slide showing exactly what that means, and it's one that Matthew dug up recently. You can see that between 14 and 10 nanometers, Samsung improved the pitch and they introduced a new structure. And between 10 and 7, they had further pitch scaling, they introduced another new structure, and added EUV. And as I discussed in the recent podcast, between 7 and 3, they will introduce these gate-all-around transistors. What's important to understand here is that none of these initial nodes are design compatible. There might be some tool compatibility between 14 and 10, I can't remember, but there is definitely nothing compatible between 10 and 7, as 7 introduced EUV. But I'll get back to that point soon. Moving on to the next sentence, and Nvidia's CEO Jensen Huang, again, said that most of the next generation 7nm orders will be handed over to TSMC, and only a very, very, very small proportion of orders is given to Samsung. And so clearly, this second statement overwrites the first one, and we can be fairly confident of why. Samsung's poor 7nm yield. Now, next up was my source telling me that the Quadro Ampere is very efficient. And for as long as I can remember, the Quadros are essentially the best performance per watt chips, but they're the same chips as the GeForces. And yet, we keep on hearing about rumours of high power draw for the GeForces, 12-pin power cables, and only today WCCF Tech have been reporting that the RTX 3090 will have 3 8-pin connectors. That is an extremely power-hungry card, if true. And finally, like I said before, there are multiple commentators saying that Samsung 8nm, that's the node with 100% confidence. And so if you put all that together, all those statements together, and it really does look like my source was wrong. But like I said, I had a photo of an actual Ampere graphics card months ago from this source. So how do you make all of this tie in? Well, the original plan was clearly Samsung 7nm, which means that Nvidia started designing Ampere for Samsung 7nm maybe 18 months ago. The design very likely taped out, but then around about October-November time last year, the yield issue at Samsung became apparent. But are we supposed to believe that after this, Nvidia went back and redesigned Ampere on 8nm? That's a non-EUV node, and they've got this ready in less than a year. Ampere's set to launch next month. That would be like 10 or 11 months from design to shipping product, which is just not realistic. And for a similar reason, switching over to TSMC after they figured Samsung couldn't yield 7, that is similarly unlikely. It's a brand new design because it's a completely different process. But we know it's not Samsung 7nm, as Huang stated categorically that TSMC would have the majority of 7nm wins. And there would be very, very, very few at Samsung. And there is no CEO on the planet who would flat out lie like that. But if it's not Samsung 7nm, and if it's not TSMC 7nm, and if it's not Samsung 8nm, then what is it? Well, the most likely answer to that is Samsung 5nm. I said 10 weeks ago that Nvidia would never lose. They wouldn't risk their gaming superiority on an older process. Even with AMD toiling a bit on performance per watt, they would have known that a new architecture for AMD could easily fix that. And they also know that TSMC's 7nm was a great process. They just didn't want to pay the wafer prices, so they went to Samsung looking for a deal instead. You remember what Jung said? Until recently, Samsung has been working really hard to secure partners for foundry cooperation. TSMC are the clear fab leaders, but Samsung have actually been leading in EUV, and they've been buying a lot of EUV machines from ASML. And from what I heard, they could have as much as 70% of the EUV machine market. They just can't yield the process. But even with the yield issues on 7, Samsung continued to buy even more machines for their first real attempt at 5nm. And this is also likely what TSMC has done. You remember all that thing about the branding changes and AMD were no longer specifying EUV as being part of 7nm. So it's likely that TSMC have also been having one or two issues with 7nm EUV. And that is also one of the reasons why I was fairly sure that we wouldn't see Zen 3 until much later this year or early next year. Whether that's been down to EUV or not, nobody seems to know. However, we can be very certain that Genoa or Zen 4, that will for sure be N5. What Samsung have been doing is, over time, they have just been trying to improve their 7nm EU process. And all this 6, 5 and 4, again, it's basically just marketing. And as we can see, 5LPE, this will be their main node. But it's just 7nm disguised as a lower number. Jensen used sly old Doglo, and yep, it's true what he said. TSMC will get the bulk of 7nm orders from Nvidia. But what does all this mean in terms of performance though? Well, over at SemiWiki earlier in the year, we learned that Samsung's 5LPE doesn't have a pitch shrink over 7LPP. And it looks like it could have been more appropriately named 7LPX. It's basically 7 with extra options and enhancements. But importantly here, 5LPE is IP compatible with 7LPP, which means that the same 7nm Ampere designs, which Nvidia started out with, they're basically good to go on this 5LPE. And the performance gain over 7LPP is about 10%, or around about 20% better power. It's an awful lot like TSMC's N7P. And again, over at SemiWiki, if you look at Intel's transistor density metric, we can see that Samsung and TSMC's 7, they are pretty similar in characteristics. And since this point, which was well over a year ago now, both of the companies will have improved on these nodes, but the differences aren't huge. What's likely happening here is TSMC's is likely just a little bit better on characteristics. However, it is yielding a lot better. And that basically leaves us with the explanation of why then did Nvidia choose Samsung? And the obvious answer being, Samsung needed the foundry partners, and there are few coming much bigger than Nvidia. The yields might be poor, but that's a cost that Samsung will need to pay, not Nvidia. And Nvidia, they get a marginally worse process at a much cheaper cost. And yep, the Quadros will be very efficient, as they will be the best performance per watt parts, and they'll be limited to about 250 watts or so. GeForces, they can be ramped right up in voltages, which will improve the yield and the clock speeds. And to be honest with you, literally nobody will care about a 400 watt graphics card if it demolishes the Turing generation. And there is absolutely no reason to believe that Ampere won't do that. Right, on to the summary. Nvidia were never going to lose to Navi 2X, and the faster that people accept that, the better it will be for everyone. This is no longer a contest, it's about Nvidia beating Nvidia, and it's been that way for years. And they got stung by Turing's reception because many people thought that it just wasn't fast enough compared to Pascal. In a way, Pascal set them up for failure on 12nm because it was so fast. But when you've got an already great architecture in Pascal, getting even more performance out of what was essentially the same node, that is not an easy thing to do. You either need to improve the shaders or add even more. It means even more die space. And Turing was, of course, absolutely huge. And we got used to seeing zero improvement with Intel's new processes. But now we understand why, and that was down to them losing their edge. But we saw that AMD made huge efficiency gains at 14nm, both in CPU and GPU. And then between 14 and 7, they made an incredible CPU gain and a less good GPU gain on 7nm. But make no mistake about it, that was due to RDNA 1 being somewhat flawed. And again, the cards were pushed a little too far past their sweet spot. And with RDNA 2, AMD are set to make their first real 7nm progression that they should have made, or it's just a little bit too late. And it's this late part that is the worst part of it for me. But look, honestly, I am not going to slam the Radio and Technologies group any longer. I've done it plenty in the past, and by this point, I have to say that I don't even know if it's their fault, or is it more likely, I'm afraid to say that AMD, the entire business AMD, they simply do not take PC graphics seriously. The game consoles are shipping, and there are reports of them being perhaps even using a more advanced RDNA 2 architecture. Yet here we are again, still waiting on Navi 2X on the desktop, with no obvious date set, except for before the end of the year. What's going on with that? I don't know. What I do know is that Nvidia will get a very, very good improvement this generation, because it's like I've said for the past year, even Turing on 7nm would demolish RDNA. And they won't have Turing, they will have Ampere. And it's on a kind of 7nm branded as 5. And I guess what they'll do is what they did with Pascal. We'll get a very slow rollout at very high prices, and the public will go crazy for them. And with their marketing machine in full swing yet again, and a possible change of branding to 2100 series, not sure about that one, but still, it's interesting to see how well that their marketing generates hype for the products. And if I am right about this, then you have to say that Nvidia deserves it. They deserve to take all the glory once again. Catch you later, guys.